Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on tips to increase your organization's resilience. My name's Gregg Brown, and I'm really thrilled to have you all on today. We have people from all over Canada, so both from coast to coast, as well as all over the United States from coast to coast, and some people as far north as the Yukon, and people as far south as Australia. So I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar today. So a couple of things before we get into our content, just some logistics. If you have any sound or technology or technical issues, please just put that in your question pane below, and Lauren Connor, our wonderful logistics person whose picture you can see here, will do her best to troubleshoot any issues that you have. You also all have a control panel in front of you, and I have that on the slide so you can see, and I'll just walk through what a few of these buttons mean. So the red button at the top is if you want to minimize the control panel, so just click on that if you need to do that. The next button there is for if you want to make the webinar full screen, so you can just hit that button there. And this button here is a question button. So if you want to pose a question, by all means, please, if there's things that come up as we're going through our webinar today, and you'd like to ask a question, I'll do my best to get to them. Please click on that button there, and it'll give you a little chat box, or not a chat box, a question box for you to enter your question into, and we'll do our best to get to those. So today I am so thrilled to have Dr. Linda Hoopes on our program today, who's the president and founder of Resilience Alliance. And Linda is one of those wonderful authors and researchers who I love working with, because she is able to take very complex concepts around change management and resilience and leadership and really translate them into practical, hands-on-the-ground tools that we can all use on a day-to-day basis. And that's one reason we really partnered with Resilience Alliance to deliver their programs because of that. So Linda, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today.
Hey Greg, thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Now you're calling us all the way from Atlanta, where I think it's probably quite warm. What's the weather like down there?
Oh, it's beautiful. It's about 50-something degrees Fahrenheit and sunny.
Sounds wonderful. So for those of us in the rest of the world that might be thinking about Celsius, it's about 10 degrees Celsius, I think. And so those of us who are in colder climates at this time will take some of that warmth through this webinar today. So welcome. I'm so happy to have you.
Thank you. As I said, I'm pleased to be here.
Wonderful. So one of the things we had talked about, Linda, when we were preparing for this was to really level set around what we're talking about in terms of resilience. And since this is your wonderful definition that I use all the time, maybe I'll let you speak to this and set that context for us.
Sure. A lot of the work that I've done on resilience has been done in organizational settings and around organizational change. And one of the things that we know is that most organizations have multiple overlapping changes going on at any one time. And some of those changes are small, but some of them are very disruptive. And on top of that, people have changes going on in their personal lives, in the world around them. And so when we add all of that up, the demands, many people are facing high levels of disruptive change. We find that some people and some organizations deal better with those than others. So what we're looking at is how can we understand better what enables some people and some organizations to display lower levels of unproductive behavior. So we can, when we get unproductive, when we get overwhelmed by change, we can start to see symptoms of overload that include symptoms of physical stress. We can see people making more mistakes. We can see people getting cranky with others. We can even see people really acting out in some pretty awful ways as a result of stress. But the bottom line for organizations is that people are not applying all their energy most productively to getting the work done that they need to do.
Well, and I think that's a really important point, because one of the reasons I really like this definition is because, to me, disruptive change can be something that's, say, really small that happens on a daily basis at work that just is disrupting you constantly, that might be out of your control, to something that might be a really big level of disruptive change, such as, maybe getting a new CEO or reorganizing the organization. And all of that takes our energy away from dealing with our day-to-day stuff that we need to deal with.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think about it in terms of physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual energy. We use all of that to deal with the disruptions that we face, whether it's a flat tire or a new boss or whatever it might be. We're engaging that energy to try to regain a sense of control and a sense of being in a good place.
And I think, one of the things I like about the concept of energy is that it always takes energy for us to handle change. So we can't have, as leaders, that expectation that people can, maintain their same level of productivity while handling change. There's always going to be a little bit of unproductive behavior going on because it does take energy for us to handle change. And I love, when you put it into those four pieces, and that's why those of us sometimes who are having a lot of stressful moments during the day feel really physically or even mentally exhausted at the end of the day.
That's right. And one of the distinctions I've been making lately, as we start projects in organizations, we oftentimes need people to think differently, behave differently, do their work differently. And I've been making the distinction between work and impact. So changes create work. Like if you're in the training department and you want people to learn to use a new protocol in a healthcare system, for instance, you might develop and roll out training for how to do that. That's work. The impact is on the people who have to learn to use this in their system and to figure out how to weave that in with taking time away from their day to work with patients and, to wrap their mind around this new way of relating to the world. And that impact is what consumes energy. And so that human energy to absorb change is actually one of an organization's scarce strategic resources that it needs to manage.
Absolutely. So let's look at some of the capabilities and change muscles that you talked about when we are looking at helping ourselves and help others be resilient. Do you want to walk us through these?
Sure. Based on a lot of research and gathering of information about what enables some people and organizations to operate more effectively than others in the midst of disruption, we've identified a set of things that we call change muscles, or that we think of as change muscles. The first one is being positive. So at the individual level, that looks like being able to see opportunities and not just dangers. It looks like being positive about your own capabilities. But you can look at that at the organizational level as well, too. Think about an organization that has a generally optimistic tone toward its market, toward what's going on, versus one that is focused on guarding against all the dangers and problems that are out there. Then we have focused, which is being clear about where you need to apply your energy in the midst of uncertainty. Flexible is about being creative and opening up options to draw on new ideas, other people, etc., to help you come up with creative new solutions to the challenges that you face. Organized is about putting the structure and discipline in place so that you can use your energy most efficiently. So that you can take the predictable parts of things and not have to spend a lot of energy on them, so you've got more energy freed up for the unpredictable. And then proactive is about learning, experimenting, trying new things so that we're not locked into our old familiar ways and we need to, to be proactive, we need to be prepared to jump out there and take some risks. So those are a set of things that we've identified that help people use their energy most efficiently and most effectively when they deal with challenges to yield resilient outcomes.
Well, I think what's really, what I find certainly, delivering this work on the ground when I'm in a workshop setting or, consulting with organizations is that, people will often say, well, I'm a really positive person or I'm really focused. And, people will sometimes think that positive means, oh, I'm going to, when bad things happen, it's going to be roses and lollipops and sunshine. And that's not really what we're saying here. We're really saying that, when these disruptive changes happen, we do need to look for opportunities eventually at some point to figure out how we navigate through this change. And I think that's, a really nice differentiator with this work.
Sure, absolutely. Sometimes it's just about being able to recognize that we're in a tunnel and we're trying to spot the light. Sometimes all positive is about holding on to some shred of hope that we can get through this thing.
Absolutely, and I think there are so many degrees attached to these as well that is really nice for those of us who do this work and who've worked with the assessment tool that goes with this to really help us, examine a baseline of where we're at now and how we can actually think of these as muscles and really look at little tips and tools to build these up.
Absolutely.
So now that we've talked a bit about the personal resilience piece, let's move into the organizational context and look at some of the tips that we have here. Now, for those of you listening, Linda wrote an article on 10 ways to increase your organization's resilience, of which we base this webinar on, and we are going to share this article with you after the session so that you will have a copy of it. But I always think there is, you can read something and it's one thing, but making it come alive and hearing the different nuances to these pieces, I think, are what's, really important and what Linda really brings to our discussion today. So as we escalate this to talk more about organizations, we know that a resilient organization, of course, is one that can maintain those levels of performance while experiencing disruptions. And they're often the ones that can handle going through change in a different way than organizations that might be less resilient. Right, Linda?
Absolutely.
So
there's a lot of, I was just going to say there's a lot of different kinds of challenges that organizations can face that require an organizational level of resilience. You may have a new competitor enter the market. You may have a product liability issue. Somebody may get sick from eating the food that you served. Whatever it is, there are things that are going on all the time, regulatory things that cause challenges with organizations that they have to respond to. And so a resilient organization is one that can do that quickly and effectively.
And would you say that those are often the ones that you found in your research that are able to, work through those difficult times and still, maintain, the work that they're able to do and the people that they have in their organization to do it?
Sure, absolutely. They can pull everyone together, get everyone moving in a common direction, take that energy and apply it to solving the problems and to maybe even coming out stronger, to learning from the challenges, to really figuring out how to become a better organization because of the challenges that we've faced.
Cool. Well, let's start with the first one around hiring resilient people. And I know, as someone who's hired people over the years, we have, behavior-based questions we ask as part of the interview process to try to, determine skill set, to determine mindset, to determine fit for the organization. Talk to us a bit about, looking out and hiring resilient people.
Sure. So there's an ongoing debate about individual differences in resilience, and do people come with certain levels of resilience, or should we invest more of our energy in developing everybody's resilience? And I come down somewhere in the middle. I think there's a lot to be said for helping people, wherever they are, develop their resilience. But we also know that there are things that people have come with in terms of predisposition. Some people are just born with a more positive way of thinking about things, or learn it very early on in their life, or have life experiences that have led them to, to exhibit any of these characteristics. And so I really believe that, especially for jobs that are facing a lot of change, it's really worth taking resilience into account in terms of who we place into positions of high change. And so I think we can hire people for resilience. Now, the tool that we've talked about is an example of a way not to do it, because that tool is designed for personal development. But you talked about behavioral interview questions, talked about looking at resumes. For instance, if you were to ask somebody in an interview, tell me about a time when you dealt with a major challenge in your life? What were some of the ways that you approached that? You can learn a lot about their flexibility. You can learn a lot about whether they see themselves as a victim or as an empowered person. You can learn a lot about how they approach things that way. And so one of the things I've done with people is to lay out sort of a set of questions like that. The other way that I look at hiring resilient people, and I use this in my own work, is I look at their resume for things like, if I'm looking for the proactive characteristic, have they gone on adventures? Have they explored outside of their comfort zone? I actually tend to hire people who have sought out change, who have deliberately built their own change muscles over time, because that's one of the things that they then can bring to the table, is that capability to thrive in turbulence.
Absolutely. So when, I'm thinking in the situations where I've hired people over the years, and I'm sure many of our listeners, have been in the same place. One of the questions that's often asked of people is, tell us about a project or an initiative that you've been on, and it went off the rails or stopped working, and how did you bring that back, on track? And I know that when we ask that type of question, we'll often bring out that, especially what you're speaking around that ability to look for the opportunity and that ability to determine focus and to be flexible in different ideas, or were they really rigidly stuck in their ways?
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things I will say is that the worst thing you can do is to bring a resilient person into an environment that doesn't support it, because the first thing they're going to do is leave.
Yeah, absolutely. So speak to us about why that would be. I mean, I think I can figure out why, but let's hear about that.
Well, people who are highly resilient see change as a necessary component and a necessary ingredient in life, and they've mastered some of the skills of thriving in change. They walk into it with a different mindset. If you walk into an organization like that, and the organization is risk averse and isn't open to your creative ideas and shuts you down whenever you try to respond resiliently, you're not going to be able to practice your resilience craft there. You really need to find some place that's going to give you opportunities to change in wonderful ways.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things I've learned over the years working in the field of change is that, for me, it's not even just as much about thriving in change anymore. It's just living in change. I mean, whether it's, personal, professional, for people, most of us are just living in constant change now. And to be resilient and to help others be resilient, it's almost, seeing the value in helping people to be prepared to be unprepared. That ability to prepare people that, we're not going to have all the answers. We're not going to be able to figure everything out all at once, and that we just need to be prepared to be unprepared. And it's I think it's a concept that those of us that are working with organizations are having to embrace more and more, is that thriving in change and living in it on a day-to-day basis.
The other aspect I think that is important to look for in, if you're evaluating whether a person is likely to bring resilience to the table, is how much energy do they have? And how well do they manage their own energy? So thinking about physical energy, do I take care of my own physical energy? Do I take care of my mental energy? Is my mind actively engaged in the world? Do I manage my emotional energy well? And then I talk about spiritual energy as well, which isn't always a comfortable topic in organizations. But to me, spiritual energy is the energy that is about meaning and purpose. It's about being, part of something bigger than yourself. And so I think people use their spiritual energy in their work as well. And so if I know that someone's passion is aligned with what they're there to do at work, I know that their spiritual energy is something that they are able to draw on when challenges hit.
Well, and what's interesting was I saw an article the other day about France, the country, that they were putting some legislation in place to limit people's ability and expectations to work after hours, because they were realizing that people, because they were tethered constantly to their mobile devices and to other technology, that people weren't getting the energy break they needed to come back refreshed to work. And I was quite surprised to see that a country's actually gone forward to having even those discussions around, to me, they're all around resilience, around helping people, expend their energy, but also be able to recharge it.
Absolutely. So there's a question that came up in the question box that I think is great and reminded me of something really important about this. So one of the attendees mentioned that if organizations don't do a good job of helping people move through change, then they are zapping the resilience of the organization as well. And I totally agree with that. In fact, one of the things I think in organizations, I've seen organizations do, unfortunately, is to say, hey, we're going to help give you all these tools to be resilient, but we're not going to do our part, right? So our part is to reduce the disruption on you in the first place. We need to only bring the changes to the table that are important. We need to do them in a way that communicates well, that does not disrupt your expectations more than necessary, so that you don't have to lay out so much of your energy on the table to deal with them. And I think, people could become very cynical if organizations just say, hey, it's your job to manage your response to change, without recognizing that they have a part to it as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's look at our second tip here, because certainly, the work we do, and I know the work you do, is often working with leaders to understand their own resilience, but also how to model it and lead their people in an organization that might be going through turbulence.
Mm-hmm. So leaders are who people look to for permission to act in certain ways. And if you are if your leader comes to you and says, here, I've got a new project for you, and you say, okay, I've got 27 other things on my plate, and the leader's response is, well, just get it done, just get everything done, and you see that leader coming in at 6 a.m. and leaving at 8 p.m., and burning themselves out, the leader is not necessarily modeling a resilient response. And so you may feel like you've got to burn yourself out too, that's just part of the expectations about how you operate. And so self-awareness from leaders about how they lead change, and whether they're setting a positive emotional tone, whether they're aware of their resilience compared to the resilience of people around them, all of that's tremendously important. We found some linkages between organizational level and resilience, and every now and then we run into a leader that is so resilient and modeling it so well that they're scaring the people around them. They can absorb more change than anybody else. But more often than not, what we find is leaders that are not necessarily managing their own resilience well, that they may be inflexible, so that flexible thinking characteristic is not so much there. So they're looking for a right answer on things. Or when a change hits, they go into a complaining and deflecting mode rather than jumping in and looking for the opportunities and trying to learn from it. So there are so many things that leaders can do to be role models for resilience.
Well, and one of the things I notice, certainly, when we're doing workshops with groups, when organizations bring us in, is often it'll be the leader bringing us in to help their team be more resilient. And, they might be very resilient themselves, but there's a tension that develops between the leader and the people that report into them, usually due to the leader is, speeding down the path of change and is leading the folks through it and is very resilient themselves, and has often a group of people that they will feel, the leader's moving way too fast, we don't have a chance to catch up. What are some tips that you would have for leaders who would be in that situation?
Well, one of the things I think is important to remember is that changes are less draining when you have more control. So if you are in a position where you get to decide what happens, which is often the position that leaders are in, changes just aren't as disruptive because you get to decide how you want to respond to them. People who are on the receiving end oftentimes don't have that luxury. They're in sort of respond and deal with it mode. And so one thing is for leaders to just recognize the disparity in the level of control and influence that they have compared to people in their organization, and try to involve and include them and give them as much direct or indirect control as they can. The second thing is to create, to make resilience part of the conversation, to talk about what can we do together to be positive as we work through this. Sort of how are we drawing on our focus? You know, what are the most important things here? So I would say be conscious of how resilience is playing into what you're doing, and also have some self-awareness about how you're responding to something compared to how other people are responding. Many times, if we have a skill or a concept, it's sometimes hard to see how other people don't see it the same way that we do. And so sometimes it's about looking at it through the eyes of the people on your team. You know, how would Pat see this, or how would Debbie see this? You know, and what are they seeing from where they sit, and how can we help and support them in sustaining their resilience?
Absolutely. And I think, you know, one of my colleagues often refers to, you know, getting on to the other person's side of the bridge. So, you know, really seeing their point of view, what's going on for them, and how can I, you know, what do they need to know to come across the bridge type of thing. And I really like that analogy of you know, thinking about what do they need to know, because, you know, if everybody thought like us, it'd be really great, but unfortunately not everybody does, you know. And I say that facetiously, in that, you know, certainly the people, you know, that I talk to, it would be great if everybody thought exactly the same. Sure, because we wouldn't have conflict, we wouldn't have a diversity of opinions, there wouldn't be all that wonderful stuff that happens in the world. But the world's not like that, and people can't read our minds. And yeah, and that's why I think what you're saying is very right on when it comes to that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Let's move into our culture conversation.
Okay.
Or continue with what you're saying.
Well, one of the things I was going to say is that people's resilience is affected by things that happen to them outside the job as well. And so just one last thing on the leader piece, which is to recognize that the people on your team are human beings, and that they may be coming to work to escape the stress of of, you know, their mother-in-law just moving in, or, you know, whatever it might be. And so, you know, so recognizing that there are energy drains in other places, and really just understanding that you know, that you're dealing with a human being that only has one supply of energy. But if we move into the culture piece, to me, that's an expansion of the leader piece. So the leader, you know, is someone that I look to for influential ways of behaving, but how we are with each other, with our peers, sort of what is the air that we breathe? Is the air that we breathe one where we put each other down for coming up with a creative idea because we don't understand it? Do we listen to one another? Do we, what do we reward and reinforce systemically? So one of the things that we know is that if you look at organizational systems, in addition to the leadership, what we articulate as the vision, mission, and strategy shapes the organization. And then culturally, you know, sort of what are we reinforcing? What are we? What symbols are we using? How are we? What are we placing importance on? So culture is about the shared values, the shared mindsets, and so on. And so to build a resilient culture, we need to start thinking about, does our system, does our organization value focus? Do we have a culture where it's not just okay, but really important to focus on the most essential things? Do we have an organization where collaboration and reaching out to other people is valued, or do we have a very highly competitive culture where people are expected to go it alone all the time? So you can take each one of the characteristics and think about, how do we embody that in our culture? Do we have a proactive culture where we encourage people to try and experiment and bring new things to the table? There are several organizations that I've run across over time where people have some of their own time that they can spend on just sort of skunk works projects, and that's really a part of that flexible thinking, the proactive, the let's bring new ideas to the table, and that starts to set the tone for a culture in which we can do the things that we need to do to work our way through uncertainty. There are some cultures that are positive, people uplift each other. They work on setting a positive emotional tone. One of the things along those lines that is a quick tip is, and some of this comes out of research in healthy marriages too, is that the balance of the positive to the negative needs to be at least 3 to 1. Mm-hmm. So for every time we critique somebody, criticize them, point out a weakness, we need to have about 3 times that much where we're affirming and building up and reinforcing. And so that's an example of one way that you would attend to that in the cultures. Do we have norms around the level of positive versus negative in our interactions?
No, absolutely. And I guess the thing is around culture, you know, often people will say, well, I don't have time to do that, and this praise feels insincere. Yet what I'm really hearing you say is that that's an investment that goes a long way when we're able to share the stories that we have around resilience and share people's responses, as well as, you know, contributing using the different characteristics to, you know, helping them feel more resilient in their work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, establishing a common language that we can use, you know, making resilience be an important piece, noticing that we value resilience, you know, sending messages that say this is important. And it's not just important because it's nice. It's important because if you take 2 organizations that are in similar industries, in similar markets, they probably both have similar ideas about what they're trying to do strategically. You know, they're dealing with the same pressures, the same challenges, but the organization that can execute more change more effectively, let's assume they're doing the right changes, but, you know, if I can execute change more efficiently and more effectively than my competitor, I've got a huge competitive advantage. And so there's a really important business reason to build resilience, because it helps you you know, it helps you make more change more effectively with less wear and tear on the human beings involved. Now, back to the earlier comment, we need to make sure that the organization's doing its piece too, that it's using what we know about change management to try to understand what the impact is on people and to communicate and all those good things. But simply from a cultural standpoint, to say we aspire to be a resilient organization. You know, resilience is a strategic asset for us, and we want to build it in people.
And so then if we had that as the culture of the organization, that would filter down to the leader level and then right down to the individual level when we're going through the hiring process, as an example.
Absolutely. So I'll give you an example. Worked with an organization years ago. In the U.S., the utility industry deregulated a number of years ago. And so we were working with a company that was a utility company that used the resilience assessment, and we looked at sort of where people were on that, and we found that they were pretty typical of our database on 6 out of the 7 characteristics. The one that they were low on was flexible thought. So culturally, they were not strong in that area. They were about the 25th percentile on the average compared to our database. And it turned out that this was an organization that had been in a highly regulated industry. They were very much about processes and keeping things within the lines. They were run by a bunch of people who had come out of the military, and this was not an organization where creative thinking was encouraged or valued. And that cultural blind spot, as they were moving into an environment where they had to be much more competitive and much more innovative, was something that they needed to remedy.
Well, and that would make sense, and certainly, you know, many organizations today that are creating those shifts, whether it's external pressures or internal ones, they do need to look for those remedies to be in this day and age of you know, running an organization, whether it's public or private sector.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Hey, I want to call on another question that just came up around culture. It says, I feel that the organization's culture is sound in being aligned with the organization's values. How can we build upon this without calling it culture change or resilient culture, which is sometimes is interpreted as us having a broken culture?
Good point.
That's a great question. So I find that the C word, you know, the culture word, is actually sometimes it creates allergies in people. And, you know, figuring out how do we talk about how we behave with each other, how we operate, what we value, without even using the word culture, I think is really important. And I think if we go back to the characteristics and think about how do we reinforce, how do we make important things like being positive, being focused, etc. There are many ways to do that without implying that it's a culture change. I think it's more about what are we reinforcing, what messages are we sending. It goes back to the leader modeling. Behind the scenes, we may know that we're working on changing culture, that we're kind of looking at the underlying mindsets and beliefs and behaviors and values. But I think we need to do it in ways that just use things that we're already doing and reinforcing those. So I'm working with an organization right now that's a school system that's working on culture change, and so there are some things that they are already doing around emotional intelligence and things like that that are working toward changing the culture without us having to say, look, this is a culture change effort. It's really more how do we look at the things that are moving us in the direction of creative risk-taking and innovation and so on, and building that into the fabric in an intentional way.
For sure. I love that. That's very true.
Yep, absolutely. And so another way to do it, another way to think about it is to attach it to a really important initiative, to sort of look at the big strategic initiative that we're doing and then thinking, what are the mindsets and behaviors we need to pull this off? And so, so really looking at it as an enabler, looking at resilience as an enabler of getting something really important done, especially in terms of how we operate in teams, how we operate in groups. So that's just one more thought on that.
Well, and I think what's important, and certainly, in the work I do and in the work you do, is often normalizing for people that, sometimes we are resilient and sometimes we may not be. It depends what's going on, both personally and professionally. And while a culture, resilient culture does, is made up of the individuals and so on that work in the organization, I think it's really about putting that lens on it, that it's not about fixing something that's broken. It's about all of us being able to, increase our capabilities, and our capabilities shift and change.
And that's one reason why I like the muscles analogy. We can have physical challenges that overwhelm even the strongest muscles. We can be so overwhelmed by the changes that we're facing in any given moment that we may just feel completely swamped. But as things change, we can right ourselves, we can get back on our feet, we can bounce back, and then we can figure out how to grow stronger. So, so positioning it as muscle building, capability building, I think is really important.
Absolutely. Now let's look at we have a few other ones. We're not going to go into detail as much as we did on the first three, but these are all integral to resilient organizations. And I guess what we'd be interested in is, for those of you that are listening, if out of this list of 7 there's ones you'd like to go a little deeper into, please type that into the question box so we can see. Otherwise, I think we'll just start off with the number 4 around communicating effectively, and let's talk about how that ties into a resilient organization, Linda.
Okay, good. I'll start there, and then I see we have a question up. I'll look at that in a second, or maybe you can look at it, Greg, and see what we've got. So communicating effectively, so that's a no-brainer, right? Everybody knows we've got to communicate effectively, but here's how it relates to resilience. People spend more energy trying to regain control when they're not clear about what's going on or when they're confused. And so we actually help the organization's resilience when we are giving people at least indirect control by being clear with them about what's happening. And so we don't drain their energy as much, so they don't need their resilience as much. So that's the simple thing, the simple answer to why communication supports resilience.
Now, we've had someone also suggest if we could look at 5, and a couple of other folks have said number 6. So let's just look at 5 around that alignment around goals and tying that to resilience. Let's go a little deeper into risk-taking.
I have been working with an organization recently that has a small number of goals. The challenge is that everybody interprets them differently and starts different initiatives to try to achieve those goals. And so when I say align around clear goals, what that looks like is having a few things that are important to the organization, the ability to say no to the things that are less important, the ability to cascade those goals so that everyone can see clearly how what they're doing relates to the big picture of the organization, and then turning those goals into specific initiatives, which are things, projects with start times and end times and resources applied to them, that are well managed to help us get to those goals. The opposite of that is everybody's just making it up as they go along. We assume that we've got to do everything that lands on our plate, and nobody is able to ask the question about why are we doing this. So those are kind of the polar opposites.
For sure. So let's talk about the risk-taking piece.
Sure. So risk-taking, an environment where people can take risk is an environment where people can build their muscles. So it's important in two ways. It's important in resolving specific challenges. So we have a challenge. We need to come up with a response to it. We can't wait till everything is fully baked before we try out a response. And so the proactive characteristic of resilience is about that risk-taking, experimenting, and so on. So it's important in being able to rapidly learn, to try an approach to a challenge. It doesn't work. We learn, we adjust, we go forward. But there's a second reason why that risk-taking is important, and that is because the way that we respond to small challenges is predictive of how we respond to big challenges. Our brains start to learn new patterns. We start to rewire our brains. And so when we have an environment where people can deliberately take risks, it can enable the organization to be a really healthy, what I think of as a resilience gymnasium, where people actually have a setting in which they can try something out. They can learn about how they respond to disruption. They can consciously build their muscles so that they're ready for the bigger challenges. And so risk-taking is one of the really important markers of an organization that is prepared for resilience. Now, if that's all you've got, if risk-taking is the only muscle that you're using, there's some pieces missing because people could be taking risks without thinking them through. But as one component of it, it's really important in giving people a place to test and try and build and strengthen those muscles.
Well, and I think you can't really do innovation without some risk-taking. And, organizations are, often striving to do things differently in a new way. And we have to be able to take risks and calculated and manageable ones as well. But if we don't do those, we don't have that opportunity to try new things and to become innovative in what we're doing in the marketplace.
Absolutely. So I've seen a couple of other questions. Yes. Yeah, I saw one on number 7 and one on number 10. Where do you want to go first?
Let's just go through this. So I was thinking we would look at the question around diversity, and I'll read that out. So coming from an organization that celebrates the diversity of our team, I found it very interesting to see that as one of the ways to increase organizational resilience, and I'd love to understand how this plays into it. So you and I have lots of great talks around diversity, so jump right in.
Sure, absolutely. So first let me say that when I think about diversity, I think about both the more visible aspects of diversity, gender, race, that kind of thing, and also the more hidden aspects, which is the experiences that we have, the different strengths that we bring to the table. And when we think about how diversity feeds into resilience, there's a couple of things. One is each of us bring different resilience strengths. My husband and I are a great example. I'm a very positive person. His first place to go is to worry. He describes himself as a defensive pessimist. Well, you know what? There are times when it's really, really important to be able to think through all the things that can go wrong. And then there's times when it's really important to have some bright energy to draw on to see us through. On teams, we may have somebody who's really focused and somebody else who's really flexible. And so that level of diversity is tremendously important in bringing better resilience to the table. And then the other piece of it is that resilience is often about problem solving. It's about figuring out how do we respond to this challenge in some creative new ways. And so one of the things that we know is that we solve problems better when we have diverse input. So when we have more ideas to draw on, if we can use those things in a way, and you know that we have some additional work that we do with teams to figure out how are they best using their strengths. And so, you know, whatever the strengths might be, whatever knowledge, whatever perspectives, whatever we bring, all of that, if we can bring it to the table in a way that enables us to create better solutions, you know, if we're all thinking the same way, we can't be very creative. So it's important both bringing different resilience strengths to the table, and it's important in terms of bringing different ideas and ways of thinking to the table to solve the problems that we're facing in our different challenges.
And I think, you know, as leaders, we need to make that conscious decision to source out the diversity, because, you know, the research that I've read shows that we tend to, as leaders, hire people that are like us or hire people that are like our organization. And that doesn't necessarily create a resilient workplace, in that we need to have that diversity of experience. And I know for myself, sometimes I've purposely hired people who are polar opposites to me, not just in terms of resilience, but in terms of other characteristics, because it forces me to develop my own resilience and step out of my comfort zone to try new ways of whether it's problem solving, new ways of risk taking. Maybe it's looking for opportunities where I don't see any at that moment. And I've had to make a conscious decision to do that. And it's scary sometimes to try to, you know, hire people that are not exactly like you. And
well, I'll give you a great example.
To do that.
I'll give you a great example. The organized characteristic is not my greatest strength. I can pull on that muscle when I need to, but, you know, I really look for that in people that I hire for my organization, but at the same time, I realize that sometimes it drives me crazy. You know, that what it looks like to me sometimes is somebody who's very linear and methodical and all of that. And I need to recognize, you know what, that's part of it. You know, and so I guess what I would say is we need to both bring in diverse people and be prepared to receive them. You know, many times we honor the diversity, but then we bring someone in and they feel like a fish out of water and they feel out of place and they can't contribute their best. So we have to both hire for that and really value it and recognize that sometimes it feels difficult and awkward and uncomfortable to, you know, to deal with it.
Well, and I think, you know, I love your example of you know, hiring people around you that have you know, more of that organized characteristic that's accessible. And I know certainly in my work, you know, I have a few folks around me that, thank goodness, they have that change muscle there, because mine, I'm constantly working at building. And as a result, it creates some conflict too, in that you know, they might drive me crazy. And you know, if Sheila's listening, she's the one who has that big organized characteristic who just keeps not just me but our whole organization together. Whereas, you know, I can drive her crazy because of that. You know, I have to constantly practice to flex that muscle and to build this. And so, and it's understanding that we're not doing that from a personality basis, but that we're doing that because we're both trying to learn how the other person functions. And that's why this work is so important, is that it can bridge those gaps and take it away from so-and-so's just doing this to tick me off versus, this is what their strength is. This is the one I'm working on. Let's see how we can meet.
You know, the other place where that shows up, I've had it show up in an odd way for me. Recognizing what strengths you have around you can be important. So the flexible social characteristic, so that's a characteristic that's about comfort and sort of reaching out and asking for help and collaborating with people. It's not my weakest muscle, but it's not my strongest muscle either. I can be kind of introverted, and sometimes under stress I tend to want to go back into my office and just curl up in a ball. But I was in an organization one time where we did a group picture of our resilience, and I realized that even though that was not my greatest strength, I was stronger in that than anybody else in the organization. And I thought, darn it, no, I've got to be the community builder, right? So I realized that even though it's not where my energy goes first, I had more energy around that than anybody else did in that particular group. And so it really required me to woman up, you know, and to just say, okay, I've got to bring this to the table, even though it takes more effort for me to do that. So knowing who's around us sort of knowing what strengths are there and where we can best contribute, even if it's not the first place that our energy wants to go. We may have a million people who are good at being focused. We may not be most needed there. We may need to provide some additional energy in a different place.
Absolutely. So I'm conscious we have about 10 minutes left in our time together, and I thought it'd be good if we jumped to number 10 and looked at building slack into the environment. So for numbers 8 and 9, like I said, we are going to send out a handout, and so you will see the article and you'll see the different pieces. Do you want to say maybe a one-liner about 8 and 9, and then we'll go into 10, Linda?
Yeah, I think we've pretty well covered 8. Okay. Teams are better. So the conditions under which teams outperform individuals are exactly the conditions of change. Individuals can outperform teams in certain situations. And where there's a known answer and there's somebody who knows the answer, sometimes teams just cloud the issue. But during change, we're dealing with the unknown. And so teams, when they're performing well, can really be an asset there. So recognizing where teams are useful and using them well is important. Monitor the environment is really about the fact that many of an organization's challenges can be anticipated. But if they don't see them coming, then they get surprised. So if I keep my ear to the ground about what the legislature is doing, or if I have some good competitive intelligence about what competitors are about to come out with, then I don't get so caught off guard about what's happening. So it's really about just watching what's coming at you so that you can be more prepared.
Well, and I think that is key to being strategic as well, because we can get so involved in our tactical day-to-day thinking that it's hard for us to take that bigger picture view and monitor what's going on around us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how technology is changing, what's happening with social media, what's happening with the next generation of workers. All of those are things that we can stay out ahead of.
Great.
So we've had several questions about, the last one. So building slack into the system. So here's what I mean by that. Resilience is about how we manage our energy. If every ounce of our energy is spoken for all the time, then we've got nothing to draw on when surges come. One of the organizations I've been working with recently is in the healthcare arena, and that is an environment that is full of surges. You get a car accident and you'll get a bunch of people, all of a sudden coming into the hospital, or, somebody comes in with an emergency, and you've got to drop everything and focus on what's going on there. So slack in the system is really about having some resources that are unallocated, having a buffer in the system that is going to get used. You just don't know what it's going to get used on. And so it's as much a way of thinking about things as anything else. There are some project management philosophies that talk about, having a buffer that you draw on. And so it's really about not filling up the glass so full that we don't have room for a surprise to come in. And how do we do that? Well, we make sure that we are not running so lean with our resources that we are burning people out all the time. It really is keeping an eye on the capacity of the organization to absorb change compared to the demand that we're placing on the organization. That starts to get to building a portfolio mindset, sort of looking across the board at all the changes that we're implementing, who's getting affected by them, who's sort of maxed out in their capacity, looking for early warning signs that people are overloaded and overwhelmed, and then backing things off to the point where we have some spare capacity. Now, we don't want too much. If we have too much spare capacity, then we're probably not being competitive, but it's finding that sweet spot where we've got enough breathing space that when the surprise comes in, when the unexpected comes in, we've got some flex, we've got some ability to absorb it, or we know immediately what drops off the bottom of the list in order to attend to this new challenge.
Well, and I remember years ago when I used to facilitate strategic planning sessions for organizations, management teams and boards would come up with these a list of 30 different priorities that they wanted to do. And the reality was, for most organizations, we might do 5. And it was really, paring it down so that you had a clear, amount of goals and objectives that you could have in place to implement that allowed a bit of flexibility to take on those new things, those surges, as you said, that come in, and also using those as a filter for when new ideas come up and new initiatives come up to see if they really do align with what we're doing. Because if we take on every new initiative that comes up and every idea that people dream up, we'll often be deterred from our goals, and we will, not necessarily as an individual burn out, but you might burn out the team, the organization, because your energy is just spread out in so many different directions.
So I'm going to give two really specific tactical examples of how I've seen people build Slack. This is at a very micro level. I've seen some organizations where meetings are scheduled for 50 minutes rather than an hour. So you've got 10 minutes in between to breathe and, do whatever you need to do instead of running madly from one thing to another. And then I've seen people on meeting agendas allocate all of the agenda time except for 15 minutes or so at the end. We don't know where it's going to get used, but we know it's going to get used. And if we do that way, as well as in the bigger ways, Greg, as you were talking about, which is not filling up every spare corner of the organization with the next initiative, that pursuing the next shiny thing, focusing on those things that are essential and knowing that we've got a way to incorporate the next thing that's going to come up. I think those are some of the things that I would recommend.
Thank you. So we have about 3 minutes left, Linda. Was there a question you wanted to dive into that we haven't had a chance to talk about, but that we could do in a few minutes?
No, I think, let's see, we have a hand up. Do we have a question?
There's one around accountability.
Okay.
How do we help leaders be accountable for this sort of stuff?
So I think as we go back to leaders modeling, I think one of the things we need to expect from our leaders is that they will be good role models for these things. I mean, accountability for anything is important. Whatever we ask people to do, we need to figure out how do we measure it, how do we hold it accountable. And so accountability on the resilience side would suggest that we have some kind of measures of how well we're modeling resilience, how well we're operating resiliently. So I think that would be a next place to go, is to think about how are we tracking it? How are we giving people feedback on how well they're doing on this?
Great. Last question that was asked was a book that you could recommend. So I would love to recommend your book if I could, because it has certainly become the foundation, I would say, of my thinking when it comes to resilience. So just want to give us the title and where people can get it.
Sure. It's called Managing Change with Personal Resilience, and you can get it online. If your organization wants to buy a bunch of them, contact Greg and we'll figure it out for you. But it focuses on the resilience characteristics that we talked about and touches on team and organizational level resilience. And then my website, resiliencealliance.com, has some ideas for organizations. We also have another website called myresiliencegym.com that's aimed more at individuals that want to find information about building their own resilience. So it's less from an organizational perspective. And I'm working on another book that's kind of along those lines and talks about a lot of the energy stuff.
Perfect. Well, Linda, thank you so much for taking the time today to be with us. It's been a wonderful hour for me, and I'm sure as the feedback we've gotten so far from our listeners as well. And I want to encourage everyone who's listening to think about how you can practice and build your change muscles around resilience, and how you can go back and whether it's share this information or practice different ways to help your organization be resilient. Please do that. And we will be sending out, like I said earlier, the article that this is based upon. And feel free to reach out with any questions or comments. We are more than happy to get back to you. Again, thank you for your time today, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Greg.